I've driven taxis long enough to know that people are weird. But there's weird, and then there's whatever this guy was. He was too perfect. The kind of man you'd expect to see in an expensive car, not crammed into the back seat of my battered taxi. Tall, broad-shouldered, sharp jawline. Frankly, if he wasn't so unsettling, I might have appreciated the view. But something about him was off. Maybe it was how quiet he was. Or how his eyes, dark and unreadable, never reflected a hint of emotion. He spoke only when necessary, never small talk, just a crisp, "Here's fine," when we reached his destination. And the strangest part? He always went to the same place. Every Friday at exactly 5 p.m., my app would ping and there he'd be, waiting at the same pickup spot. The ride? Always the same route, always the same drop-off point, a lonely stretch of road on the outskirts of town. No buildings, no streetlights, nothing but a dense line of bushes. Every week, like clockwork, he'd climb out, adjust the silver ring on his finger, and disappear into the trees. The first time, I figured he was meeting someone. The second, maybe he was into sketchy business, not my problem. By the 10th time, I was too intrigued for my own good. I'm not proud of what happened next. I started waiting for his ride request every Friday, fingers twitching over my phone, half hoping he'd pick another taxi and relieve me of my curiosity. But no, he always ended up in my car. Like fate had a very bad sense of humor. And every time, my mind spun stories. Maybe he was a spy, a hitman, a cult member heading off to sacrifice goats under the full moon. But there was something more intimate about his routine. The way he touched that ring before stepping out. The way his shoulders tensed, like he was walking into something painful. Then, one Friday I cracked. I dropped him off like usual but didn't drive away. Instead, I killed the engine, slouched in my seat, and watched. At first, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, too loud in the silence. Then, movement in the bushes. He was gone. I hesitated. This was the moment where, if I had any common sense, I would have left. Gone home. Pretended I was a normal person who didn't stalk mysterious passengers into the woods. Instead, I took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and followed him. The road behind me vanished into shadows as I crept forward. The bushes scratched at my jeans, the air thick with damp earth. Every step felt like a bad decision solidifying into reality. Then, the trees parted, and I saw it. A cemetery. Not the neat, well-kept kind. This one looked like it had been forgotten by time. The tombstones were crooked, some cracked in half, names barely legible under layers of moss. The air smelled of old rain, of earth disturbed and settled again. And there he was, kneeling in front of a single grave. I ducked behind a tree, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached up and kissed the ring on his finger. I should have left. Right there. Should have turned around and bolted. But I was frozen, watching as he lowered his head and muttered something under his breath. A prayer? A name? A spell? I couldn't tell. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small and dark. I squinted, trying to see. Snap. A twig broke under my foot. His head turned. And in that instant, I knew I had messed up badly. Then, the worst part. For a moment, just a flicker of a second, his lips curled into a smile. Not a friendly smile. Not an amused one. Something else. Something that made my stomach twist into knots. Then he stood up. And I ran. If you are still reading up to this point, it is because you find the story engaging. It won't be a bad idea if you subscribed and turned on the notification you know. Now, back to the story. I didn't stop running until I was back at my taxi, hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the keys. The engine coughed to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires skidded on the dirt road as I tore away from the cemetery like the devil himself was behind me. Because for all I knew, he was. By the time I reached the city lights, my heart had somewhat recovered from its "you're about to die" performance. But my brain? Oh, that thing was still malfunctioning. I kept replaying what I'd seen: the grave, the ritual, the smile, over and over like a terrible movie I couldn't turn off. I should have let it go. I should have accepted that the guy was into some weird stuff and moved on with my life. But I didn't. Because curiosity is a disease, and I was terminal. The next week, I half expected my phone to ding with his usual ride request. It didn't. Friday passed. No call. No mystery man. At first, I felt relief. By the third week, worry crept in. Had he seen me that night? Did he know I'd followed him? Maybe he'd switched taxis. Maybe he'd stopped going altogether. Maybe I'd ruined something. So I did something really stupid. I started lurking near his usual pickup spot. Just casually parking my taxi like a perfectly normal, not at all creepy person. And one night, my patience paid off. I spotted him. Same time. Same place. But instead of waving down a taxi, he just stood there, staring at the street. My heart slammed against my ribs. This was my chance. Before I could think better of it, I stepped out of the car. He noticed immediately. Those dark eyes flicked to me, unreadable as always. "Hey," I called. "You avoiding me?" His lips parted slightly. Surprise? Amusement? I couldn't tell. "You drive a taxi," he said. "Not a detective's car." Ouch! Rude. "Yeah, well, you disappeared. Thought maybe I scared you off." A pause. Then, in the most unbothered tone I'd ever heard. "You didn't." I crossed my arms. "Then why'd you stop calling my taxi?" Another long silence. Then, at last, he sighed. "You followed me," he said simply. Not a question. A statement. I swallowed hard. "Yeah. And?" His jaw tightened. He looked past me, like he was considering whether to walk away. But then, something in him shifted. A decision. "Come with me," he said. I blinked. "Wait, what?" I was about to call a taxi. "You want answers?" He glanced at my car. "Drive." I hesitated. My brain screamed bad idea, but my feet were already moving. Because I am very stupid. We drove in silence. No GPS needed. I knew exactly where we were going. The air felt heavier the closer we got. When I pulled up to the usual spot, he got out. Only this time, he turned back. "You want to know why I come here?" he asked. I nodded. He gestured for me to follow. My stomach churned, but I stepped out. This time I wasn't hiding. We walked past the hedge and into the cemetery. He led me to the same grave. The name on the headstone was barely legible, but I could make out a date. "A Friday. My wife," he said quietly. I sucked in a breath. "She died here," I whispered. His fingers brushed the ring on his hand. "She died giving birth. A Friday, just like today." A heavy silence settled between us. I suddenly felt incredibly small, like I'd trespassed into something sacred. "I've never been able to let go," he admitted. "So every Friday I come here. And I talk to her." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. For the first time, his voice lost that cold, distant edge. He told me about her, how she'd been kind, fierce, stubborn. How they dreamed of a life together. How that dream had been ripped away. "I know it's pointless," he murmured. "Talking to someone who isn't there." I shook my head. "Doesn't sound pointless to me." His eyes met mine, searching. For what, I didn't know. Finally, he exhaled. "I should finish." I nodded. I didn't leave. I just stood there. And for the first time, he wasn't alone. The silence between us thickened, as though we had both stepped into a space that was too small for our words. He knelt at the grave, his broad shoulders hunched, as though the weight of the world had fallen upon him. There was no sobbing, no dramatic gesture of grief, but there was something in the way he moved, something that suggested he had been carrying this sorrow for far too long. I stood there, watching him, and a strange unease settled in my chest. The man who always sat in the back of my taxi, quiet and aloof, seemed to have disappeared entirely. In his place was a man broken by something I couldn't understand, yet could feel all around me, pressing in from every direction. The ring on his finger caught the light in an almost mocking way, a reminder of the life he had lost and couldn't seem to let go of. For a moment, I couldn't look away. It felt like an intrusion, like I was not meant to witness this grief. But somehow, I couldn't bring myself to leave either. I had always known there was something about him, something different that I couldn't put my finger on, but now, seeing him kneel like this, it was as if the mystery had unraveled itself before me. "Why do you come here?" My voice was soft, almost tentative, but it was the question I had been holding back for weeks. He didn't look at me immediately. His focus was on the grave, his hands resting on his knees as though he were waiting for something to answer. Finally, he looked up, and for the first time, I saw his eyes clearly. There was no anger in them, no hardness. Just the raw, quiet weight of someone who had loved and lost in a way I could not fathom. "Because she's still here," he said quietly, his voice almost drowned by the wind. There was something in his words that seemed to make the air around us heavier, like the earth itself was listening. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. What do you say to someone who has lost so much? What words are strong enough to carry that kind of grief? We stood in silence for what felt like an age, the world around us growing darker. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving us alone in the twilight. The cemetery, once so lonely and desolate, now seemed to hold us, the three of us, like a secret kept from the world. The wind stirred, but it didn't break the stillness. It only deepened it. He stood up slowly, as if the act of rising was its own form of defiance. He wiped his hands on his pants, though there was nothing to wipe away. His eyes were distant now, but there was something softer there, something less burdened. As if, in this moment, he had given a part of himself away. "I don't expect you to understand," he said, his voice rougher now, as though the effort of speaking had worn him down. But there was no bitterness in his tone. Only weariness. "I don't need to understand," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was heavy. "I just need you to live." He met my eyes then, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something break. Something that had been locked inside him for so long, it didn't know how to escape. But then he closed himself off again, as if he had remembered who he was supposed to be, this quiet, enigmatic man with a grief he could not let go of. "You're still alive," I said, trying to find some way to reach him. "And she wouldn't want you to become a ghost, too." His lips twitched, but he didn't smile. He only nodded, as though the words had made some sense to him. "I don't know if I can move on," he said quietly, the weight of his confession settling between us like another ghost. "You don't have to forget her," I said softly, stepping closer to him. "But you can't keep living in this graveyard, or you'll become part of it." He didn't respond, but something in his posture shifted. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. It was as though he had made a decision, not to let go, but to stop living as if the past were still alive. "I'll try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try." And that was all. We walked back to the car, the distance between us filled with everything we hadn't said. There was no need for more words. Not yet. Maybe not ever. When we reached the taxi, I opened the door for him, and he climbed in, a little slower than usual, but with a kind of resolve that had not been there before. "Will you be okay?" I asked, unsure of what else to say. He looked at me, his eyes clearer now, and I thought for a moment that I saw a flicker of something hope, maybe. Eventually, he replied, his voice steady, though not without pain. I nodded and closed the door, watching him in the rearview mirror as I drove off. The night stretched out before us, silent and wide. The city's lights flickered as we passed, and the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air between us. Neither of us spoke again, but I couldn't help but feel that something had changed. Not just in him, but in me. Perhaps, for the first time, I had glimpsed the full measure of the weight he had been carrying. And in doing so, I had understood that sometimes, letting go didn't mean forgetting. It simply meant living again. Please like and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Also, feel free to tell me what you think of the story.